Good evening, everyone. My name is Andy Rathman Noonan, and I am the Executive Director of the National Science and Technology Medals Foundation. We're so excited to have you all here for Innovation Unscripted with Vint Cerf and Larry Irving. First, I'd like to thank Mr. Irving and Dr. Cerf for being here to share their experiences and advice with you tonight. Award-winning science journalist Sarah Williams will lead the discussion, guided by questions sourced from students in the GW or George Washington University chapter of the Association for Computing Machinery. A special thanks to those who shaped this event tonight. The Unscripted series was first launched in 2017 and has now become a keystone of our efforts to engage and inspire the next generation of STEM leaders. We're excited to give you all an opportunity to pull back the curtain a bit and hear from two exceptional humans. Here at the NSTMF, it is our mission to build a diverse and inclusive STEM community, and a diverse and inclusive STEM community that is truly equitable and representative of our society. So where do we start? Well, it's in experiences just like this one, highlighting voices that are often left out of the conversation and creating spaces where students like yourselves can both learn from and relate to experts who share our goals for the future of STEM. What we hope to show through this conversation and all of our programming is that there isn't one way to build a STEM career, and there certainly isn't one perfect path to success. But there are, at every turn, incredible role models and mentors you can look to for advice and inspiration. We hope that tonight's conversation serves as one such reflection point for you along your way. The best way to enjoy the conversation is to watch the virtual unscripted event on nationalmedals.org. The link to the embedded video is located in the description box if you're currently watching this on YouTube. Nationalmedals.org is the best environment where you can easily submit questions using Slido and access more content about the remarkable individuals you'll hear from tonight. One final but very important note, we invite you to join in tonight's conversation, and in doing so, ask you to help us create an inclusive and safe space for all. When asking questions, please take a moment to reflect on how your language may be perceived by others here. Thank you for your contributions and for helping us create a respectful environment where everyone feels welcome to listen, share, and enjoy. Now, I'll turn it over to our featured experts and moderator to kick off the discussion.
Welcome to the National Science and Technology Medals Foundation's Unscripted series, where we're hearing from the top minds in STEM to learn more about their paths to success. I'm Sarah Williams, a science journalist, and chatting with me today are Vint Cerf and Larry Irving, both pioneers in the internet and telecommunications fields. Dr. Cerf, who today serves as a vice president of Google, is called one of the fathers of the internet. Early in his career, he worked on the Apollo program. In 1974, he published the first TCP protocol, a set of guidelines used by computer networks, including what we now call the internet. He also worked with MCI Mail, the first email service connected to the internet. Mr. Irving is the president and CEO of the Irving Group, which provides advice to international communications and IT companies, foundations, and nonprofits. He previously worked as a vice president at HP and was a principal advisor to the Clinton White House about telecommunications and IT issues. During that time, he coined the phrase digital divide, referring to the gap between people with access to information technology and those without access, and carried out research highlighting the scope and consequences of this digital divide. To our audience today, we'll be taking questions from Slido in the second half of our event. If you're watching on the National Medals website, you can submit questions using the widget right below this video. Those of you watching on YouTube can follow the link in the video's description to get to the National Medals website with that question box. The Q&A is open right now, so go ahead and submit your questions whenever you have them. Thanks for joining me today, Vint and Larry.
Thank you.
Well, pleasure to be here. Hi, Larry. Good to see you.
Great to see you both.
I'd love to first get a quick rundown from each of you about how early in your careers you figured out your path and chose this area to work in. Vint, can we start with you? Tell me what drew you to information technology.
Well, first of all, anybody that says, did you plan your career and says yes is lying. Honestly, I would never have predicted the path that I took. On the other hand, I got introduced to science and mathematics and got very excited about it in the 5th grade. When I complained to my math teacher that there must be more to this than just addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, and fractions. And he said, yeah, and he handed me a 7th grade algebra book. And I went home and I worked all the problems over the summer and I loved it. So I knew I was going to do something in science and math. Then I got a chemistry set, and my best friend and I made some nitroglycerin, which was truly stupid. Fortunately, we didn't blow ourselves up. So I knew that I was going to end up in some kind of science and technology thing, but I certainly didn't know for sure what it was going to be. And I have been blessed by opportunity showing up unexpectedly to take me in directions that I would never have anticipated.
Okay. Larry, what about you? What did your early career path look like?
My path is completely different from Vint's in so many different ways. I'm a lawyer by training and a poli-sci major, and I wasn't bad at math, but I clearly was always better with words. But, you know, as a kid, fourth, fifth, sixth grade, I was part of the audiovisual squad in my elementary school. Then in college, I put myself through college as a DJ. I was always more on the media side. I always liked the content. And I began to realize as I went through my career that there were policy implications to some of this content. Who got to choose what content was going to be seen over what platforms it was going to be seen. So I left the a law firm. I went to Capitol Hill, and I was fortunate enough to work with a couple of congressmen, Ed Markey and Mickey Leland, who had the regulatory bent on technology. And so working for Leland and working for Markey, I went from my love of content to how do we create space? How do we create policy that allows great content creators and folks who can build great platforms to flourish and thrive in this environment? So I came at it from the policy side, not the science side.
Okay. Larry, tell me a little bit about your job right now. You know, other than doing lots of Zoom talks like this, what does your day-to-day work look like?
My work is fascinating. It really is. I serve on a number of boards. I serve on the board of the Texas Tribune. I still care deeply about public media. I serve on the board of something called Reliability First. And you know, you can't have any of the things we have unless you have a reliable electricity grid. And so part of our job at Reliability First is keeping the electricity grid up. And I also advise, I advise a number of portfolio companies for a private equity firm that are doing amazing things, everything from trying to help content providers on who are writers and creators, trying to help small businesses that are using and micro businesses that are growing. It's a company called IT Renew that I get to work with every day that is trying to find a way to, we have these huge carbon intensive servers. Can we recycle them? Can we have a circular economy in servers? So every day I'm dealing with really smart people around the globe who are thinking about new ways of using technology. And it's the entrepreneurial spirit that gets me excited. I can help them with policy. I can help them with, you know, ESG kinds of things, environmental, societal, governance kinds of issues, and they teach me what their businesses are. So it's really a great back and forth between us.
It's great. What about you, Vint? Obviously, everyone knows what Google is, but what do you do?
Well, my title at Google is Chief Internet Evangelist. It was not the title I asked for. When they asked what title I wanted, I said, how about Archduke? Because I thought that sounded really cool. But Larry and Eric and Sergey went away. They came back and they said, you know, the previous Archduke was Ferdinand, and he was assassinated in 1914, and it started World War I. Maybe that's a bad title to have. Why don't you be our Chief Internet Evangelist? I said, okay, I can do that. So my job, in part, has been to try to get more internet built all around the world. And as Larry knows, that it takes more than just technology. It often takes policy. It takes decisions about who can invest in what, policies for competition, policies for neutrality or neutral provision of services. So that's a good part of my time has been spent until recently traveling around the world 3 weeks out of 4. The last 6 months, I've been sitting in this chair in my basement office doing the same kind of traveling, just over the net. And I have to admit to you that it isn't too bad, because I can go to Australia and Austria and be home in time for dinner. And that's really quite, you know, it's nice. And I get to see my wife for dinner more than I did before. So this has been not so bad for me, but I know it's been really tough for a lot of people. Just to round this out, like Larry, I also have some extracurricular activities. I'm part of the cloud team now at Google. Again, very interested in offering services to the public sector. But I also get to do things like working as a visiting scientist at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory on an interplanetary extension of the internet. I sit on the NASA Advisory Committee, which dovetails with that activity. I sit on the visiting committee for advanced technology at NIST, where I get exposed to a lot of the standards activity and, of course, deep research that they're doing on measurement. I run several nonprofits that are generally focused on how do we make the internet a better place and how do we make it more useful for everyone around the world. So I have ample opportunity to follow this course of getting more internet out there and making it more useful.
Okay. Well, I think it's fair to say you're both, really interested in the question of how we can use the internet and telecommunications to improve society. You've both worked in the policy arena, held positions in government, and spoken publicly about how to guide policy. There are a lot of people who work in IT who don't ever get involved in helping oversee that, daunting but integral policy part of technology. Why did each of you feel it was important to get involved in that way and not just sit hidden behind a screen? Vint, what about you?
Well, of course, I slipped into policy from the technology side of things. I started working on internet as far back as 1969 as a graduate student at UCLA, then on the faculty at Stanford University. Then I joined the Advanced Research Projects Agency in the Defense Department to run the internet program for DoD. And at that point, I'm sliding into policy as well as technology development. And then I went into the private sector to work for MCI, where policy was suddenly very important to me because MCI was a telecommunications company, strongly and heavily regulated, or at least regulated, although I think during that period of time, regulation was getting to be somewhat less. And I'm sure Larry can explain, that interesting evolution of regulatory framework and attitude. So my view has always been that the technology is what it is. It tends to be relatively neutral, but how it gets used is very much a function of the policies associated with its use. And just one other thing to add to this, I used to be chairman of the board of the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. And one of the things that we evolved there was a practice called multi-stakeholder policymaking, which basically said, everyone who might be affected by a policy should have a seat at the table to opine on the consequences of various policy choices. Once you settle on a policy, of course, the enforcement might be done by a much smaller, more focused group. But the important part about all this is that multiple parties who would be affected participate in the policy making. And that's something I'd love to hear Larry's view about, because he would be sitting on the government side wondering whether this multi-stakeholder thing is a good thing or not.
I can start with that and come back from the other. And so part of my job at NTIA was helping to stand up ICANN. And Becky Burr and Paula Bruning and a lot of folks who were involved in the early days of ICANN governance were kind of came out of an administration that really did believe that we needed more voices rather than fewer voices. And I'm going to tell a story about the early days of the Clinton administration. I think is evocative of the way that I think Ron Brown, who was my boss, Secretary of Commerce Brown, but that came across all of us, permeated across the thought of all of us involved in tech policy. Ron and I had been in the office maybe 2 months, and we get this memo from the White House saying that Ron's going to be the secretary of something called the National Information Infrastructure Advisory Committee.
Right.
The internet was then called the NII, we called it the Information Superhighway. And the White House sent over a list of 25 names. And those names were almost all computer engineers, and they were almost all scientists. And I think 23 of the 25 were white men. And the other one Asian man and a white woman. And Ron told me, send it back. And I sent it back to the White House, and they're like, dude, the White House has sent this to you. This is the list. And Ron said, I'm not going to be chair of anything that looks like this. And they said, but it's the internet, and these people are the internet. He says, are people who are doctors going to use the internet? Are teachers going to use the internet? Are people involved in commerce going to use the internet? Will the motion picture industry use the internet? Well, they have a stake in this too. And some of those folks are Black, and some of them are women, and some of them are Latino. And so we wound up with a committee that I think it wound up as 12 white men and some white women, but it looked like America. And it had the motion picture industry and the television industry and the healthcare industry and commerce. And that's where we kind of, that kind of staked out the ground. We were going to work on the Clinton administration, that the internet was for everyone. So everyone had to be involved in its design. And, for young folks who may not know this, but the comment of putting people first, that in looking at the internet, we were putting people first, that was sincere. That wasn't just a slogan. how are we going to use the internet to improve American lives was kind of the focus on everything we did.
So it's Vint. I just have to jump in with a small little anecdote. You mentioned national information infrastructure.
Yep.
The term came, it was first surfaced in 1986. Al Gore was senator, and he had a hearing, and my partner, the guy with whom I did the original internet design, Bob Kahn, was one of the people testifying at that particular hearing. And he introduced this term national information infrastructure into the discussion. And it triggered a resonance with then Senator Gore, because his father is the one who introduced the Highway Act, Defense Highway Act, which is supposed to build an interstate highway system so we could drive missiles around to keep the Russians from targeting fixed silos.
Wow.
So we built the national highway system. We never actually dragged missiles around. But Al Gore really resonated with that and said, my God, we could have the moral equivalent of that highway system in the information infrastructure space. And he carried that with him, of course, to the White House as vice president.
And Gore was an amazing, I mean, I don't know that we would have had an internet without Al Gore, but we would not have had the intellectual investment, the capital investment, the focus, if not for Vice President Gore. And a story that many people may not know this either, but every Tuesday morning for 90 minutes, Al Gore presided over a meeting at the White House with cabinet members and sub-cabinet members, Reed Hunt, Ron Brown, Joe Stiglitz, Laura DeAndrea Tyson, and again, across the various silos, Bo Cutter, National Economic Council, Ann Bingman from the Antitrust, he brought together some of the smartest people in the administration, because in 1993, when the Clinton administration took over, there were 15 million people on the internet globally, 15 million. Today, we're at 4 billion. Would we have been more than 15 million anyway? Yeah, we certainly would have. But would we be at 4 billion today? And would we have the same structure? I'm not sure. And that kind of focused attention, it paid off for America. And so his love of his dad and what his dad did, I spent Tuesday mornings at 8 o'clock for 7 years. I was in the vice president's office if he was in town.
I did not know about that. And it's a wonderful story because it shows you how that administration tried very hard to draw people together around the table in order to accomplish an objective that required a lot of them to cooperate with each other. And the internet doesn't work if a lot of people don't cooperate and collaborate with each other.
And really smart people. I mean, anybody who knows Tom Khalil or Mike Nelson or some of these, then young people who are among the best and the brightest in this country, Vanya McCann, who's ambassador over at State, just really good, smart people and we're sorry we're cutting you out of this conversation, Sarah, but really good, smart people who loved the country and came together from different perspectives. I didn't know anything about diplomacy and, Tom didn't know much about, commercial markets, but when you put all these really smart people together with a common purpose, that's when the magic happens.
So Larry, do you think that level of inclusivity and bringing diverse people together still exists at a policy shaping level right now?
I don't think it does, but I don't have as much visibility inside of the of this administration as I had in the Obama. I know it was fascinating seeing, and I'll tell you one other story. So 1992-93, I was part of the Clinton Gore transition team. And there were 4 of us involved in telecommunications and quote unquote NII activities. And I was the most senior person in that group of 4 in 1994. Wow. And I had never been on the internet at that point. So it was really from a telecom perspective, get smart about the internet and make this happen. And there were vice presidents, people and others coming in. In 2008, 2009, I was on the Obama-Biden transition team. And there were probably 100 people involved in internet and IT policy, and I was in the middle of that stack. And there were people from Facebook, Google, Cisco, various government agencies. So I went from being El Jefe to being a corporal in a very short time, and my ego wasn't hurt by it at all because these people knew a lot more. I mean, they had hands-on experience in the 4 years I'd been away that I just couldn't keep up with.
So, Sarah, if you don't mind, once you wind Larry and me up, we're just going to like the little.
Go ahead. I'll give you one more chance to talk. Then we're going to get to some student questions.
Okay. So I wanted to help people get some perspective here. So 1993, which is the beginning of the Clinton-Gore administration, is roughly when the World Wide Web becomes visible to the public.
Yep.
It's the Mosaic browser that comes out of the National Center for Supercomputer Applications. And shortly thereafter, within a couple of years, Netscape Communications is making commercially available web servers and browsers. But I want to now go back. In 1983, 10 years before that, is when Bob Kahn and I turned the internet on operationally. And 10 years before that is when we started actually working on the design. So it took 20 years to get to the point where Larry and the rest of the Clinton administration could walk in and begin to arm wrestle with the blossoming of the internet and all the side effects of that. And of course, it's some decades since that time, and we're still seeing things evolving.
Yeah, well, that's a great segue. Along with all the fantastic benefits of the internet, there is also misuse and fraud. And
Right.
Rishi, a junior at GW, submitted a question ahead of time asking whether misuse of the internet frustrates you or motivates you. What's your take on that?
Are you asking me, Vint?
Whichever one of you wants to jump in.
Well, from my point of view, it's a disappointment, of course, but this is a relatively neutral platform, and it's like any other tool. You can abuse the tool. I mean, think of a hammer. You can pound nails or you can pound heads, and the hammer doesn't know. So the internet doesn't know if it's being abused. It's an amplifier and it's an enabler. It gives it all of its power, and it also gives it the potential hazards that come with it. So I'm disappointed with human nature. I am energized to try to preserve the value of the internet and its openness and its geographic spread, while trying to find ways of dealing with the abuse that does not upset what we all think of as universal human rights. And so that's the struggle, in figuring out how to do that either technically or by policy or by suasion. Is one of the challenges. And I know, Larry, you must be struggling with the same thing.
It's funny, as she was asking the question, it took me back to like 95, 96. And, the precedent was an interesting thing because things always twist. And so 93, 94, 95, 96, everything was great about the internet. It's perfect and it's wonderful. And then about 96, 97, you started seeing more articles about the dangers of the internet and the problems of the internet. And I was talking to, it must have been Secretary Brown, it was either Secretary Brown or Secretary Cantor, at the Commerce Department at a big staff meeting. I said, look, if you think of the internet as Times Square, there's a lot of squalor in Times Square. There's a lot of crime in Times Square. You have to be very careful in Times Square. But think of all the beautiful Broadway shows that happened in Times Square. Think of all the art that is created. Think of all the joy it's brought people. And there's always this trade-off. You need cops on the beat. You need people looking out for miscreants. You need to kind of balance it. So I am disappointed that people will take a tool that is this magnificent, that has so much opportunity for uplifting humanity, but there's never been a tool that's been mentioned in the history of the world. Fire, knives, pens, whatever you want to talk about, people have used them for bad purposes. But I can't think of a tool that in 40 years, or 47 years, if you go back to 1973, that has connected so many people, that has saved so many lives, that has allowed people to exchange so much information, that has generated so much knowledge. So am I disappointed? Yes. Am I frustrated? A little bit. But I'll never again be a full teletopian, but I will never be disappointed in what this internet revolution has created, because I've seen those kids' eyes light up, and I've seen people get healthy, and I've seen, plays and shows and heard music that I could never heard in this lifetime but for it, and know that's multiplied by billions.
Yeah.
So, Larry, I just hope it makes you determined.
It does make you determined. It does.
Good.
Well, along those really similar lines, Grady McPeak, a GW junior, asked about freedom of speech. Grady said, what do you think would be the optimal balance between the protection of freedom of speech and the regulation of misinformation and hate speech online? In other words, to what degree, if any, should hate speech or misinformation be tolerated? Is there an easy answer to that?
Larry, sorry,
there is no easy answer. There are only difficult answers. I do not believe the government is the right arbiter of what is. I don't want to be Germany. I understand Germany's history with Nazism, and then some of the government there says we're not going to allow certain speech in our country. That's not how we were created. That's not the gestalt within the American continent, we believe that, you know, good speech drives out bad speech. That said, I do believe if you run a platform, you have a different responsibility than government, and I do think that you have to step up. You know, I pick up the newspaper today, and or I watch Channel 4 over the internet from Britain talking about how there were intentional efforts to mislead Black voters, or that folks are trying to stoke violence or stoke racial hatred. I don't believe that. I don't want a Trump administration. I don't want an Obama administration determining what I see. That's not the role of government. But I do think that the New York Times or NBC or Comcast or iHeartRadio do make determinations what's going to go over on their air. And platforms are neither the government nor are they broadcasters, but they're somewhere in between. And I do believe that looking at the number of problems we have, they've got to step up. And you know, self-regulation isn't working. I hate to see government step in. Government usually steps in with a cleaver rather than with a scalpel, and that troubles me too. But I don't think we can continue down the road.
Is there a platform that you think is doing well at this, that has found that fine balance and that should act as a model for other platforms, or is this just so new and unexplored that—
I can say this, I think, better. You know, I'm not with any of these companies, and it's a sliding scale for me. I think Twitter has done it better, but they're nowhere close to good. And I think others, it's a sliding scale backwards from there. And there are no easy answers. And I know a lot of the executives, a lot of these companies haven't been around a long time, and I don't question their goodwill. I don't question their patriotism, but I do question how much of their arsenal they brought to bear against this. You know, there are scary times in this country, and there are some, you know, I live down the block, or not down the block, I live less than 2 miles from Comet Pizza, and folks in Washington, DC know Comet Pizza. And I was on that block at Politics and Prose 2 days before a guy brought a gun because of a QAnon rumor about pedophiles in the basement. That's just one incident. And I was 2 days away from, you know, being around a guy with a gun because of a misstep. We got to do better than that.
So now we get to some serious debate, because I want to argue several points here. Larry, it would be really good for us to sort this through. First thing is scale. In the case of the New York Times, there are editors and there are reporters. There are a finite number of them, and there is a process by which stuff gets published. There's a whole editorial filtering thing. In the case of user-generated content, which is the situation we have with the social media, we have a couple of billion sources of information. On YouTube, which is the primary social networking platform that Google operates, we get somewhere between 400 and 500 hours of video per minute uploaded into the system. Just think for a minute about what that means. So the first problem is that there's a huge amount of generation going on, and the classical ways of trying to deal with content moderation are not as easily achieved. Second point is that some people have been saying, oh, well, the solution to this is artificial intelligence and machine learning. And although there have been some spectacular results with machine learning, like the AlphaZero systems and AlphaGo that played Go better than humans did, which is truly astonishing, and recognizing cancerous cells and self-driving cars, all of those things have been achieved in part. Natural language translation, speech understanding, all achieved in part with machine learning. But the problem is these technologies are brittle, and they're based on training against large quantities of content. So now we have to figure out, how do we characterize the content that we want versus the content that we don't? And now you get very quickly down a slippery slope about what content is going to be rejected, on what grounds. What if you have a mixture of content? Suppose we're doing a television show, you and I, and we're talking about this problem, and we want to show people examples of some of the abusive behaviors. If you had a program that was looking at that, it might say, ha, look, they put this bad stuff on their show, we should cancel that information. But that won't be the right outcome, because the system doesn't understand the context in which the content was being used. So I would argue that we really don't know exactly how to cope with the scale and the number of sources of content that flow through these various systems. And we are going to have to learn how to do that, but I don't think we have a snap your fingers solution to it.
Do you
And I
agree
agree
with
with-
Larry? Do you agree with Larry that it's the platform's responsibility to arbitrate that, and it's their job to figure it out?
Well, I think, look, we already do a certain amount of filtering as it is. And we've all agreed that child pornography is simply unacceptable. We try to write software that will flag things. We get human beings to double check if the flag is on. So we're trying to do things like that. On the other hand, I don't think that we should end up with an enormous liability if the attempt to automate the process does not work 100% perfectly, because it won't. And so we really do need guidance, which we don't have. The same thing shows up in Europe. There's a thing called the right to be forgotten. And the European Court of Justice declared that we had to accept requests to remove things from the index of the World Wide Web if it was reached by way of someone's name. But they didn't give us any guidance about which requests should be honored and which should not. So, for example, a politician whose behavior should be known to the public and who wants to have the system remove that from visibility might actually not be asking for something that's acceptable, whereas someone else who's had a problem and it's gone away since then might have a perfectly reasonable request. So there has to be, we're back to multi-stakeholder policymaking, trying to figure out how do we formulate a reasonable set of rules that can be implemented by the private sector, protect people's freedom of speech and freedom of access to information, and at the same time protect against abusive behavior.
So I can't find a word that I disagree with, but I do think we're going to have to find solutions. I am concerned about algorithms that drive you to more and more obnoxious stuff.
Yeah, that's a good point.
There's also a problem there.
Let's go there. Let's go there for a minute, because that's a feedback loop, which was a Social Dilemma movie, which is a little over dramatized, but it highlights the feedback loop. And I agree with that. We could change those feedback loops so that they don't reward people for harmful and extreme expressions, because extreme expressions attract a lot of attention. And I finally figured out why this must be. It's an evolutionary survival feature. If somebody screamed to you, "There's a bear," that piece of information is important for you to attend to and to run like hell. You don't even think about it. We've evolved a response to warnings that typically say bad things are happening, and you've seen the measurement of the propagation of bad information in the net is much faster than good information, so to speak. And I think it's part of this warning response that we've evolved to use. So we need to understand this. I need sociologists, I need anthropologists, I need psychologists to help understand what the right tweaks are to these various algorithms in order to tone down the reward system for the extreme behavior.
And Sarah, where I think we're both probably agreeing is, I don't see either of us saying we need huge government interference in this place,
Right.
But I do think that there's a role for government to ensure that folks are taking this seriously. But I don't, I've been in government on and off in my career for the better part of 4 decades. I've been in and around government. I can't think of a government agency that could handle the kind of complex, complicated, ever-evolving set of issues that are around hate speech or malicious conduct or political misstatements that it would take. And to me, it is violative of our First Amendment. And so when I add those things, if we don't put the responsibility to some, and again, I understand I don't want to punish, I want to reward in terms of how these platforms deal with these issues, but it's getting pretty serious. And again, by 2 days. But
I got a new idea for you, Larry.
Okay.
Not a new idea. There's this thing up here. It's called your brain. We could call it wetware. And there is a practice that's called critical thinking. And it might be really good to train kids and adults how to think critically about what they see and hear, so they can do some of the filtering for us.
Yeah, but if you spend time on social media and you see we're in a country right now where we don't even agree on facts. We don't even agree on facts. I mean, I'll say, God, it's awful. 200,000 people died. And my friends from a different political persuasion say, isn't it great? Only 200,000 people died. It could have been 2 million. I mean, that's where we are as a country. and multiply that by 1,000 issues.
Then I will claim on this chessboard that we're playing right now, I will claim that at least critical thinking is a move in the direction of trying to get people to think about facts. I understand your problem, which is if you don't agree on the facts, it's very hard to agree on anything else.
Yeah.
Well, it sounds like once again something that needs lots of stakeholders to all come together and figure out. Since you did mention COVID, let's move on to some of our questions from GW students related to that, because we had a lot.
Okay.
Linnea, a GW junior, submitted this question for you, Larry. How has the digital divide changed since the 1990s, and how specifically has COVID changed or furthered this divide?
So it's funny, I mentioned the companies I'm involved in. Maybe the company that I'm fondest of is a company called ENA, which is Education Networks of America, and I actually sit on their board, and we're connecting schools and hospitals and libraries. You know, when we first started looking at digital divide in 1994, 95, and then started, my last report was 99. If you were older, if you were poorer, if you were if English wasn't your first language, if you lived in rural America, if you were less educated, you were less likely to have access to the then dial-up internet. Fast forward 25 years. If you're older, if you're poorer, if you're less educated, if you live in rural America, you're less likely to have access to the internet. And the difference is in 1999, 1995, if you weren't connected to the internet, it wasn't a great thing, but it wasn't a life-changing thing. You could live most of your life without access to the internet. In 2020, it's just not possible. You couldn't have this kind of a conversation if you don't have broadband internet. There are 15 to 17 million school children who don't have home internet connectivity, which means they can't even do their schoolwork. I mean, the homework gap was a problem before. You couldn't do your homework, you go to a library or whatever. Now, when classes are in you can't have access. 27% of Americans over the age of 65, those Americans who are more likely to have serious consequences from COVID, don't have access to the internet. 1 out of 4 senior citizens, and disproportionately they're low income and disproportionately they're senior citizens of color, who are the ones who are being hit the hardest because there is a higher mortality rate and infection rate among Black and brown communities than in the larger community across America. And they're the ones who can't use telehealth because they don't have access to these technologies. When you look at those kinds of issues, we've got to do a better job. And the only good news about this pandemic, this one source of good news for me about this pandemic, is that it's brought to public attention the need to connect every American. Yeah. We now understand the cost of not connecting people in a way. Before it was an anecdote, now it's data. Now it's fact. Now we're seeing the consequences of not connecting people.
So I completely agree with that, and have done ever since my starting the work on internet, because I always believed everybody should have access to it if they wanted it. One thing that we can say about COVID-19 is that it's highlighted a number of fractures in our social and economic system. And in that case, it's if we understand and accept that and take advantage of that knowledge, we can make a better world for everyone, including our own people. There are technologies that are coming. What we need to do, of course, is to expand the broadband access. FirstNet, for example, may result in a number of towers going up where there weren't any before. Hopefully, some of those towers could be used to extend broadband for the general public. The low Earth orbiting satellite systems and the stratospheric balloons and solar-powered planes, which are starting to emerge now into technological demonstration, will offer new avenues for access to internet at higher speeds and lower latencies than we've had before. So I think we are at least on a path towards more opportunity to provide people with access to the net.
You know, it's two things. Domestically, we talk about the digital divide in two different ways. And it's ideological, and it makes me crazy that it's ideological. To some policymakers in Washington, the digital divide is only rural. It's only people who are geographically can't get access. And that's 5 million American households roughly. And that is a problem. And we need to spend the money in the same way we did TVA and REA, and we had universal service for telephone service. We need to find the will and the wallet to connect our rural American brothers and sisters. Then there's an urban and suburban divide. And that's not about having access. There are pipes or wires running or wireless technology available. People just can't afford it. And we had roughly 15 to 20 million households that just simply couldn't afford broadband. And that was before the pandemic, when a significant number of people lost a lot of money. So that whatever that number was in January of this year, it's a higher number now.
Yeah. Okay.
And so we've got to spend some level of money short term, maybe Band-Aids, just to get people online, to keep them in school, to keep them connected to their would-be employers, so they can get emails about potential employment, so they can do health services. But then we need to find a more fundamentally sound way of keeping low-income people connected. And one of the things that I'll bring it up now because it makes some sense to me. Every public library in this country, in part thanks to Bill Gates, in part thanks to the government, the Gates Foundation, their first project was connect every library to the internet, and then they made it broadband. So most libraries already have a gig or better network going into the library. Every public school in the country, that was something that Bill Clinton said, every school, a library and public health clinic will have internet connectivity. So we have 97, 98% classrooms connected to the internet. So they have fairly capacious pipes in most schools around the country. There is no reason why you can't take that pipe that goes into that facility, school or library, put an antenna on top, and using spectrum, basically make wireless spectrum available to people in that community. Maybe it's just to students, maybe it's just to low-income people, but we can find ways to use those public facilities smarter, better, and not that expensively. And should we subsidize, a poor or moderate grade internet connectivity through a commercial provider, or maybe give a more robust free service to school children at a certain price point? Those are the things we need to think about. I'm hoping folks are thinking creatively about how to use our public institutions. The to and through philosophy works for me. And I see Vint, I'm not sure he's convinced on this one, but I'd love to see our public institutions, our public libraries. I would not have had the education I had if it wasn't public libraries and public schools. In my public school area in New York City, right around PS 118 in Southeast Queens, 43% of the kids in that community don't have home broadband. 43%. We've got to find a long-term solution for those kids so they have the choice of the kind of opportunities I had, and we don't have those opportunities yet. Vint?
So I actually agree with all of those choices of solution. We put Wi-Fi capability on buses, for example, school buses and things like that. And sometimes we park the school buses near the kids so they can still get access while they're at home. But that's a sort of a stopgap measure. What we need is real infrastructure that's built purpose built to make sure that both rural and urban access is available. And I think subsidies make a whole lot of sense. The former Universal Service Fund, if it could be aimed at broadband everywhere and can take advantage of some sort of subsidy, is another part of the solution. And as I say, if the Starlink and similar low Earth orbit satellite networks get into place, it'll be hard to escape access to the internet. Then the only question will be whether the cost is affordable. And if for some reason it is not for some portion of the population, once again, we can come back to your comment about the potential for subsidizing what that cost is to make sure everybody has the choice.
We have a program called Lifeline. It's a federal program. It's $9. I helped create that program in 1985, working for Mickey Leland. And it was $8 then. It's now a big $9.25. $9.25 does not buy you much telecommunications these days.
No.
And even our definitions of broadband, and I don't know if Vint will agree with this or not, but we declared broadband as 25.3. 25.3. It's not close to enough to. And if you have a household of 2 kids and you're bringing a 25.3 line into that house, neither kid's going to have a positive experience, and they can't do Zoom, they can't do their homework. We need to go to probably a 100/100 standard should be my big.
A gig. Come on, man. It's a gig for everybody.
Let's work our way up to a gig. I want a gig, but I don't. That may be cost prohibitive. But if we had a broadband standard for urban and suburban America that was 100/100, we'd see massive change for millions of kids around this country, and for lots of applications that people can't do right now because they don't have the bandwidth.
Well, hopefully COVID starts pushing innovation in this area more. Many of our viewers today are students trying to figure out their career paths and determine, where they can make an impact when it comes to the convergence of society and IT and telecommunications. What's your advice to them? Is there a lot of room for innovation in these fields?
Oh, God.
It's endless. I mean, look, it's software.
As we've been hearing, I guess.
Yeah, it's software. Okay. Software is an endless frontier. It only is limited by your own imagination and your ability to write code. And so to the extent that we are moving rapidly towards an environment where software is interposed between us and virtually everything else, there's just infinite possibilities there. There's also infinite hazard. And the reason for that is that we don't know how to write software that doesn't have bugs. Bugs are mistakes, and those mistakes can often be exploited by bad guys to cause trouble. And so while we're excited about the vast application space that software offers, we also need to work really hard to remove bugs, to have the ability to fix bugs after things have been deployed, and to insist that the makers of products and services that rely on software are committed to fixing those bugs when they find them, and do so over a long enough period of time so that the device's lifetime is as bug-free as possible. And so there's lots to unpack there. And Larry, you probably have more sense than I do about how to create incentives to achieve that outcome.
Well, I'm going to kind of slightly different. I'm a word guy. I'm a policy guy. And one of the things that troubles me is that philosophy majors and poli-sci majors and economics majors don't think the tech is about and for them. And we need those folks more than ever. The 25-year involvement in policy for the internet is endlessly fascinating. If you like thrillers, if you like history, if you like whatever it is you like, the ability to be at, I remember the day that Mosaic, went to the world. I remember the day it went public. I remember when Cisco was the largest company on the planet by revenue because of folks were building out these networks. I remember the joy of going into a elementary school in Newark. The kids had never seen the internet, and showing a little girl what she could not only write, but not only could read, but what she could write and express to the world. So we need folks who understand software and understand code. We also need people who have a North Star in terms of policy. Like, what matters to you? The story of the digital divide is a really simple story. I come from a community where probably half the households didn't have a telephone when I was growing up in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, back in the 50s and early 60s. And then when I worked at Capitol Hill and we were working on telephone policy, the one thing nobody was talking about was that in the 1983, 84, 85 time period, 92, 93% of Americans had telephone service, but 80% of Black America and 82% of Latino America and 50% of Native Americans had it. And I saw that statistic somewhere, and I took it to my then boss, Mickey Leland, and said, we can do something about it. And we created the Lifeline program. And so fast forward to 1993, I go to an elementary school in Cupertino, California. I see these cute little kids sitting around Apple iMacs, and each little kid had their own little iMac, and they were like 8 to a table, and they were connected to the internet. It was so cool. And then Ron Brown and I and my then boss went up to Thurgood Marshall High School in Hunters Point, San Francisco. And the only technology those kids said in a given week was a metal detector they went through to check to see if they had a gun or a knife. And in a 35-minute drive, I saw kids who were experiencing the future every day at their desk, and a bunch of kids who are destined to have no participation in the future because they didn't have access. And that's how the digital divide got started. That's why I started the reports, because that story is compelling, but it's just an anecdote. Data drives policy. And when I could take the data of showing the disparate connectivity in America, that's when we really started talking seriously about getting an E-rate and doing these things. It starts from data. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to go on so long.
Well, actually, that's what this is all about. So on the data point, I chair an organization called the Marconi Society, and we've recently adopted a major program on digital inclusion. And one of the things that we have discovered is that a lot of the connectivity data is actually not very accurate. And so we're starting a program together with the Measurement Lab to gather data, not only in the US, but elsewhere, using real live measurements off the network to tell us how well how adequate is the access that people have, what bandwidths do they get, what latencies do they have, what kinds of jitter do they experience, and use that data to help shape policy. So you and I are in agreement.
Is the data overestimating connectivity or underestimating connectivity?
It is. Right now, it is way overestimating, because the way in which many of the internet service providers do the calculation is that they look at a census district and they say, if anybody has broadband in that census district, everybody is counted as having access to it. This overstates the actual penetration and availability of broadband access. And so my view is that the engineers need to give real data from direct measurements from the internet all around the world. And that data should be available to everyone to help make policy and to make plans.
Well, and when you get the data, let me know, because I'll be happy to help push out the message. This matters.
You're hired.
But going back to the question, Sarah, this is for the students. There are so many opportunities. There's so much you can do in this space. You know, what kind of content gets portrayed? Who makes the decisions? Issa Rae, some of the students may know this woman, Issa Rae, on Insecure. And she's on HBO. And she went to a guy who's a gatekeeper for HBO and says, I've got this great show. And the guy happened not to be a minority. He said, hey, that show's not going to sell for Black people. And she's a Black woman. She says, what are you talking about? This is exactly the show Black Americans want. That guy is no longer at HBO. She now has 5 different programming strands across the network. So, I mean, what you need are people who are daring, who have an idea, who think that they can contribute something. There are so many parts to this, whether it's Internet of Things, machine learning, AI, there's so, robotics. I mean, there's so much going on. Virtual reality. Are you a gamer? A friend of mine just went from the NBA to a woman running the drone racing league, which is an internet-based, which is like Formula One meets drones on the internet. Wow. What do you love? There's a place on the internet for you. I don't want to understate, how many opportunities these kids have if they want to do these things.
That's absolutely great.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to move on to some of our questions that have been submitted through Slido from our viewers who are watching this conversation. The first one is along the lines of a lot of these things we've been talking about. Should internet access be considered a basic utility like electricity, phone, gas, and water?
So that raises an interesting question, because it certainly feels that way increasingly. I mean, when your electricity goes out, of course, everything goes away, including the internet. And so one thing I would point out to everyone is that as important as the internet has become, electricity may be even more important. But setting that aside for a moment, when you don't have access to all the apps on your mobile, if you have a smartphone, it's amazing how disabling that can feel and actually be. And so what that suggests, of course, is that once you become very reliant on something, then you have to insist that it be provided in a safe and secure way, just like water, just like road maintenance and all the other infrastructure. So now, whether it needs to be as heavily regulated as the previous infrastructure has been is still an open question in my mind. As long as we create sufficient incentives to overcome the problems that Larry and I have been talking about, we may not need heavy regulation. But I would say regulation, among other things, provides incentive. Liability provides incentive. And so figuring out what's the right package of incentives to drive the outcomes we're after is what is needed here. And I think a lot of people look at the situation that they don't like, and they'll just say, I don't like it. And my reaction to this is figure out what incentives drove that outcome, figure out what other incentives would make a difference, then figure out how to get those incentives in the right places to promote a different response.
So I had this question the second or third time today I've had the question about utility, and I still don't have the answer down right. I believe that the internet is as important as the telephone was in 1950 or 1960, and we treat it as a utility. That said, you get into a theological debate over whether or not the internet should be regulated like a utility, and I try to avoid theological debates. I believe that everyone should, my wife's a pastor, so I always lose theological debates. I believe that everyone should have access to the internet. I don't want overly heavy-handed regulation in it, because it is so incredibly fast changing. There are few things in life that have moved as fast as the internet. If you had told someone in 1993 or 94 what the internet of 2020 would look like, most of them, even the most visionaries, wouldn't have believed that we'd get this far this fast in 26 years or 28 years. It just didn't seem possible. And we would have made a lot of regulatory mistakes. I remember when Congress was debating whether or not we should require ISDN, which was a broadband standard, as a national standard. ISDN wouldn't even drive like, an AOL. I mean, there's nothing you can get ISDN, but we wanted to make that a standard. And so I'm loath to make it a utility. I have no problem saying that our government should do everything it can to ensure that every American that wants internet connectivity has internet connectivity at an affordable price. That's something short of saying it's utility, but it is absolutely declaring that you can't live modern society without internet access.
Well, then it just calls for creativity in terms of incentives to drive exactly the outcome that you want. And, you know, just like the R&D credit drove certain outcomes in terms of heavy research and the technology transfer and things like that, that's where we can get very creative in terms of, not in terms of heavy-handed regulatory policy, but incentives to drive outcomes.
Absolutely right.
Okay. Another question, this is for you, Larry. What concrete things can be done to reduce the digital divide that's been accelerated by COVID? Is this about government funding or about inventing new ways to connect the unconnected?
I don't know that there are that many new ways to connect the unconnected. I think there may be some creative ways. I know some people in communities are thinking about things. I think it's mostly about funding. I mean, you know, I don't think there are too many problems with connectivity that money wouldn't solve. And it's just, you know, it's the same thing with telephones. You know, we have a low income heating assistance program, right? So when people don't have gas in their home, they can get, in the winter, and they live in Northeast, they can get access to gas. We've helped subsidize water. We've helped subsidize telephone penetration. We need to do the same thing for the internet.
So we should have internet stamps, just like you have food stamps.
Well, I think it's two things. I mean, I think we can find a way to have some public facilities. Like, I grew up in a house where we didn't have a lot of money, but I was a reader. I had public library, and the public library provided me access to books. And it wasn't you didn't have to have, here's $100 a month so you can go buy books. It's, here's a public facility where you can get access to all the books in the world, and the public is hoping to provide them to you. I would prefer to see something like that, where, because you build a permanent infrastructure. My problem with, we could change Lifeline to a $50 a month program, and we could give that $50 to commercial providers who would then give a substandard service, as they do with the, the internet connectivity programs they have now. And that, to me, so you're giving people, you're spending a lot of government money for a non-permanent solution for substandard service. That gets hard.
Well, I know we don't want to get into a detailed debate about this, but I would suggest to you, well, I mean, there's a certain amount of time and a bunch of questions, but I will challenge you on this one. Let's suppose that you do increase that, the capacity to subsidize access to the net. Now we should ask ourselves, who gets to sell that access to the consumer? Remember, now this is a subsidized service. Why don't we measure what those consumers are getting? Why don't we build some incentives and maybe even some liabilities associated with failure to deliver adequate capacity, failure to deliver the quality of service that's needed? And the reason I'm not willing to accept a library-like solution as the sole mechanism for response is that we've learned something from COVID-19, and that is that even libraries have had to close. You can't fit everybody around the library in the car trying to do homework. We need to let people be wherever they need to be in order.
No. I mean, I would have the library actually radiating a wireless signal from their tower from up top that goes out a mile or two.
You need to talk to some of the radio experts about how much capacity can be provided on that tower and how does it get reached and at what frequencies. And, there's a bunch. This is not trivial stuff.
Oh, no. We're
how to lay out, and you should talk to the 5G guys about the problem they're going to have with closer towers and fiber on interconnects in order to deal with the higher frequency stuff. So,
I don't agree. We're looking at those issues. Kind of a rump group of nonprofits and for-profit companies that supply libraries.
Fine.
We're trying to figure out those issues. But I'm also, but I also, my concern about the first thing you noted in terms of measurements, again, you start getting really close to utility model, and you have a lot of government folks doing the monitoring of whether or not the service is being provided, and that also concerns me.
Well, hang on. You mentioned standards, and I'm sorry, Sarah, you've lost control of the whole conversation. Here we go.
Okay, I'll give you one more minute, and we'll move on.
Well, standards are really a key here, and I agree with you that we want to be careful about adopting legislation, for example, that's bound up in some particular technology. But certainly talk about what the desirable characteristics are of an adequate or a premium service that we want people to have access to. Look, we do this with food. The FDA actually looks at the food we eat and they say, this is not satisfactory. This does not meet the standards. You're not selling this to the public. Or they say, you sold this to the public and we discovered that it's got, this bacteria in it and you're going to take it back. So I think we can build a framework. I know you hate this idea, but we can build a framework that uses standards in order to provide incentive for people to do the right thing. And if they don't do the right thing, others need to have the opportunity to step in and do it.
Last comment on this before we move on. I don't hate anything that brings low-income people and rural people and immigrants and people with English second language affordable, capacious broadband. I am not locked into a solution. What I have noticed is that, Comcast and Xfinity are a wonderful company. What Internet Essentials is a lousy product, and yet it gets sold as a solution to the digital divide. And poor people should have dignity too, and they should have full, real broadband, and that's where I have my problems.
Then we need to open up competition. We need to open up competition. And that may be happening, especially if these, the satellite systems are a new competitive path that's alternative to fiber and to radio. So,
I'm on board with it. Whatever works to bring people to PS 118, their kids access, but also the kids in Cottonwood, Texas, and also the kids in the Navajo reservation. I don't have a theological bent on any of this. I have what's the most practical, affordable, rapid, sustainable way of getting these kids and their parents access to broadband, to real broadband.
Me too.
Okay, a couple more questions that are really forward looking, and then there's quite a few people asking about looking back on how the internet has evolved. But along some of the lines of what you've been talking about, where do we innovate or regulate for the future internet, on the protocol or the platform layer? And what assumption about the initial internet design should and should not change?
I'm gonna leave that one to Vint.
Okay, so the first thing is that some of the fundamental principles behind the internet design we should hang on to because they're extremely powerful. The internet layer, the IP layer, has two particular properties which I do not want to see ever go away. The first one is that the packets that flow through that layer of protocol have no clue how they're being carried. They don't know if they're going over a satellite link, over a radio link, over a laser driven piece of fiber. They have no clue. It's sort of like a postcard. Postcard has no idea how the hell it was being transported. Could have been on a backpack, or it could have been a boat or a plane or a car or something, a truck. And that's important. So you don't know how it's being transported, which means any new transport technology that comes along, like the satellite system that Elon Musk is putting up, is fair game to carry the packets at that layer. Okay, so that's a very important ignorance that's built into the design, in my view, on purpose. The second part of that layer is that the packets don't know what they're carrying either. They got it's like a postcard that has a to address and from address and some content. But the network doesn't know what the content means. It's the software at the edges of the net. This is the end-to-end principle that says you put it into the net, it goes through the net, pops out the other side unchanged, and then you get to interpret what the bits mean. What does that mean? Well, that means that if you wanted to have new bits that mean voice or video or a spreadsheet or a piece of email or part of a web page, the network doesn't have to change when new applications are invented. So that's a key design principle in that core important layer of the internet. And there are other similar kinds of principles that show up in various layers of the architecture. And so those things we need to hang on to. The second thing is that the internet's basic layered protocol architecture was designed to be expanded. So I can build new things at every layer. In the case of the internet protocol layer, we went from IP version 4, now we're implementing IP version 6. You can have those things in parallel. At the next layer up, the transport layer, there are multiple protocols that are available. And if it doesn't do what you need it to do, you're free to invent another one. So it's a really open architecture. All the standards are readily available. The Internet Engineering Task Force publishes those things for free online on the internet and have done ever since the beginning of this whole project. So, those are the sorts of things that, in my view, give me hope that when new ideas are needed, that there is room for them to be incorporated into the architecture. And the same argument can be made for the institutions that make up the internet's, zoo, because when we need to, we create new institutions like ICANN. Yeah. It was needed at some point in the late 1990s, and the Clinton administration helped to give birth to that. And you helped with that. So, and we do this all the time. So my sense right now is that there is ample latitude to solve these various problems, in some cases by creating new capabilities.
Okay. A similar question someone posed. Why does it feel that a disproportionate lot of the best minds in the last decade or so have been focused on innovations that are more or less solving first world problems, apps and social media and streaming? Where's the next internet, or what does it look like?
Well, I can give you my answer. I'm curious about where Larry might be thinking. For me, starting in 1998, the next internet has been the expansion of the internet to cover the solar system in order to support manned and robotic space exploration, which is heating up, as you all know. Our return to the moon is coming in 2024 with the Artemis program. There are more spacecraft going to Mars and to other parts of our solar system. And a rich networking capability will enhance our capacity to support both manned and robotic space exploration. So we've spent the last 20 years developing a new suite of protocols that will work in deep space. It turns out that the TCP/IP protocols of the internet don't work very well when there's a 40-minute round trip time between Earth and Mars because the speed of light is too slow. And of course, then there's this problem of celestial rotation. We don't know how to stop that. And so if you're talking to something on the surface of Mars, it rotates away and you have to wait till it comes back around again. So a networking environment for interplanetary internet, for me anyway, is one of the next steps in the internet's evolution.
Okay. Larry, what do you think?
It's fascinating because the very first time I heard Vint talk about the interplanetary internet, and he won't remember this, we were in Israel in probably 1996 or 97, but I remember being on a
right away.
Sorry?
It would have been around 97 because I didn't start talking about it until I was in Geneva in 97, saying, wow, that's a really amazing idea. So yes, it was, you've got the right time frame.
So we were I was at a conference with him, he was talking about it, and first I heard it. But meanwhile, back on Earth, one of the things that I have noticed is, in the United States, what gets funded is what's fundable. And the folks who make the funding decisions at the VC level and the angel level disproportionately are trying to solve problems for people like them. So, mom's not doing my laundry anymore, so I gotta go to Washio, and I'm drunk late at night and I don't want to drive, so I get Lyft and Uber, or I don't have a place to stay, so I get Airbnb. But if you look around the world, there's a lot of innovation coming on around the world. We are in, I'm not going to get too deep into it, but we are in a race with China, and what Tencent is doing and what App is doing, they're trying to solve problems that Chinese consumers have. If you look at what happened in Kenya with regard to the fact that folks don't have access to money, and all of a sudden we had digital currencies and things that are happening. When I talk to friends in South America, one of the things that entrepreneurs do is they try to solve the problems of people that they interact with. And there are companies emerging across the planet trying to solve local problems for local people. We may not see them and they may not get into our marketplace. When you have 4 billion people though on the internet, you don't need as large a number of them. So I think for the first 20 years of the internet, it's been driven by the West and primarily the United States. I do think the Southern Hemisphere, the East, and Africa and others are going to, as they get connected, will start creating apps and applications and companies that solve problems for the people that are using those technologies. We are a ways off, but let's not forget the internet experience is 27 years old. Most of that 27 years, it's been American VCs that have been, the dollars have been driving that innovation. I don't know when that will end, but I do see that we're on a glide path to seeing other players coming in, using their own ingenuity, solving problems for their constituency.
Okay. Here's a fun question. Vint, in RFC 1607, you lay out a virtual time capsule to be opened in the 21st century. If you were to write it today to be opened in the 22nd century, what would it be? And I'd love it if you could give us a little bit of background on that first time capsule too.
Well, I think at that point, I was thinking about the interplanetary extension of the internet. And so I wrote it from the standpoint of somebody who was on Mars or the moon or something. I don't remember the details now. And the idea was to explain to people how we overcame problems of the past, which would have been the present, since I was back to. And the purpose of writing that particular thing was to help people feel comfortable that the problems they were experiencing and the arguments that they were having had been overcome. And the consequence of overcoming them was an extraordinary blossoming of the internet. So if I were talking 22nd century, there will be no doubt in my mind, first of all, that the solar system will be fully networked. It will be richly interconnected on whatever planet we happen to be on. It will just be there. You won't even think about it. Some people will think about it because they're the ones that keep everything running. But for most infrastructure, most people don't think about it until it doesn't work. And then we think about it a lot, like when the power goes out, or your telephone doesn't work, or the roads are blocked, or all of those things. No water, can't flush the toilet. Now what? So infrastructure is that thing which we don't pay any attention to until it doesn't work. I don't think that we will have figured out faster than light travel by the 22nd century. I could be wrong about that. And people who keep saying that quantum communication will solve the speed of light problem don't understand that quantum entanglement is not the same as communication. But we will have quantum networks. Without any doubt, there will be quantum networks, and we will be able to run quantum computers at distances from each other and allowing the quantum communication to be maintained so that these multiple quantum computers can actually work.
What will that enable for people who aren't familiar with quantum computing?
The value of quantum computing is that you can compute certain solutions much more quickly than you would with a conventional machine. And so some of the problems, here's an analogy. It used to be that a spreadsheet was a piece of paper and you had a calculator and you took a week or more to fill out every column, in every row. I used to do that. It was my job when I was working on the Apollo program. When the laptop came along, and when spreadsheets were designed for it, suddenly you got instantaneous computation. And the result was that you could use the spreadsheet as a way of exploring possibilities because you could do it so quickly. In the case of quantum computing, the quantum speed up for really hard, big problems is fast enough that you can use it to explore possible answers instead of grinding away to just get one. And so that's what the power of quantum computing will be, the ability to solve hard problems quickly enough to explore various possible alternative solutions and to pick the best ones.
Okay. A number of people have asked a variation of the same question for both of you, which is knowing what you know now, if you could go back in time, what's one thing about the internet or about internet policy or about protocols that you would most likely go back and change, and why?
Well, in my case, one thing is that if I could whisper in the ear of my younger self, who with Bob Kahn tried to figure out how big is this thing going to be. We knew it had to be global, by the way, because we were designing it for the Defense Department. We knew they had to operate everywhere. And so we did a little back of the envelope calculation in 1973, and we said, okay, let's see. How many countries are there, because we have to operate in all of them, and we didn't know the answer, and there wasn't any Google to ask, so we guessed 128. Then we said, how many networks? And we thought, well, maybe there'll be 2 per country because we just finished the ARPANET. It was a fairly big project, and so we figured maybe 2 of those would be enough. That's 256 networks worldwide. And then we said there'll be maybe 16 million computers per network. And so that gave us a 32-bit address space. And if you could densely allocate that, that would be 4.3 times 10 to the 9th addresses, which is more than there were people in the world in 1973. So we said, okay, that ought to be enough for this experiment. And I thought, if it worked, that we would then do a production version. Well, the experimental version escaped into use. It got out of the lab. And so around 1992 or so, everybody's saying, you know what, we're running out of room, or we will run out of room. So we developed 128-bit IP version 6 design for the packet format. That has 3.4 times 10 to the 38th addresses. That's 340 trillion addresses, which is a number only the Congress can appreciate. And so if I could go back and whisper in my ear and say, you should really just pick 128 bits and stick with it, but I couldn't justify it. Can you imagine? I need 340 trillion addresses to do this experiment for a system I don't even know is going to work. So probably couldn't have gotten away with that. Some people say, what about security? Could have done a better job. The answer is, if I had had access to public key crypto in a timely way, I would have tried to fit some of it in. We fortunately could retrofit that. And so that's why we have HTTPS today and TLS and some of the other things, and digital signatures and other related public key crypto. But the timeliness of its arrival was not quite right for putting it into the initial system and trying to get graduate students to be disciplined about the use of cryptographic keys is hopeless.
Okay. Larry, what about you? Anything you would go back and change that you've been involved in?
Mine is much more mundane. So in 1999, I finally left government. I left government after doing my last Chinese American Telecom Summit. And I really wanted to stay for that Chinese American Telecommunication Summit, because in 1999, there was virtually no internet in China. And I was still being an evangelist of why China gets the internet. And they told me at the time that there would be no US investment, they would do it themselves, and they'd build the equivalent of a Bell operating company per year, which was 30 million households per year they were going to build. And they did it. Yeah. Had I known that my influence was going to be so minimal in terms of what China ultimately did, when I left the government and I started a job with, I started a company with Irvin Magic Johnson and Howard Schultz. And we were going to try to drive internet penetration in the Black and brown communities using Magic's persona and image. And unfortunately, we started in December, January of 99 into 2000, which was after the worst time to start. And had we started 1 year earlier, I really think we could have had an impact on getting, you know, the amount of buzz, the amount of mind share we got when we did start was astounding. These were communities that were being underserved. I told, and I don't think Ted will get upset me saying, I was on a panel with Ted Leonsis, who was one of the 2 or 3 most senior people at AOL, and I became a consultant at AOL later. And I said, look, you guys really can't sell another computer or internet connection to a white guy with a blue shirt and khakis. And yet you're missing a whole bunch of like Black and brown people who have neither khakis, but do have a blue shirt, who if you marketed to them, they'd be all over this. It's music, it's entertainment, it's life, but you don't market to them. And I really do think we could have had a market uplift in the same way that there's a Black Twitter and there's a, you know, Facebook is, you know, Latinos and Black folks over index on Twitter and Facebook. There is a draw if you make it, if you try to do it through markets. Not everybody has the money, but I do think we could have glide pathed our way into greater connectivity earlier had I not been so insistent I was going to go to China one more time and try to convince them how important the internet was.
Oh, well.
Well, you mentioned China, and actually one of the questions we have remaining is, someone asks, are we headed toward national silos around internet use, and how will that impact humanity?
Well, I think the answer is yes, we are. The treaties or the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 created the world order that we have now, which is national structures that have boundaries and borders and have autonomy and what's the right word, sovereignty within their borders, and they have control over the underlying communication systems. So they can, in fact, enforce this kind of fragmentation. I hate this. I believe that the richness of connectivity is what gives the internet some of its value. But I do believe that we will see more and more attempt to build kind of barriers for transborder data flow. I'm honestly hoping that saner heads will prevail, at least in some places, to maintain the value of exchange and access to shared information, because that's how we make progress quickly, is by sharing what we know and leveraging that knowledge in order to explore new possible solutions to tough problems. So I'm hoping there will be pressure back against the fragmentation, but I think that we will, until we solve the problem that Larry was describing earlier about the abuses of the net, there will be attempts to build boundaries. The trouble is that the infection will still be inside. Even when it's outside, it'll still be inside. And so the boundaries won't really necessarily solve the problem.
Yeah, the splinter net is a real thing, and it's becoming more pervasive, and it's a problem. And I think all of us who believe in the original vision of the internet and its power to bring us together instead of driving us apart, in some ways, splinter nets will drive us apart. I think it's incumbent upon us to clean up our act as Western democracies. And I think you're going to see China will have its own internet. And I believe there'll become a coming together convergence of the United States and other Western European democracies. The question I have is which model will emerging economies in the Southern Hemisphere adopt? Will they be more likely to look at China and say this keeps order, or will they continue to have more of a robust give and take that we may see in the West, or will there be some kind of a third or fourth models developed?
So, Larry, there's an economic response to that.
Mhm.
What the Chinese economy is quite big. In fact, theoretically, it will be bigger than ours at some point, just because of the population.
Mhm.
So you can build a wall around China and still have a significant and vibrant economy. This is not true of many other countries that have smaller populations and less vigorous economies. And so if you want to do anything to raise GDP per capita, you better be addressing a world economy. And to do that, you better have connectivity on the internet, because if you cut yourself off from the rest of the world by that avenue, you will cut yourself off from economic opportunity. And so I think that I hope that argument will be persuasive for most of the nations of the global South and others in Europe, and of course ours here in the United States.
I hope you're right. I think we'll know in the next several years.
Yeah. Well, we're almost out of time. I'm going to end on one final student question. GW senior Melody Lee asks, what are your greatest concerns for the future of the internet? And just so we're not all negative, I'll tack on to that. What are your greatest hopes or dreams for the future of the internet?
I guess I'll start. I'll let Vint have the last word. My greatest fears are that, there are still 4 billion people that aren't connected to the internet. As we're speaking, there are 1.7 billion children on this planet, school age, and 500 million of them aren't in school and don't have internet connectivity. In a world that's based more and more on knowledge and intelligence and a set of skills that are evolving, what happens when kids aren't in school for a year or two, or not getting education for a year or two, and you can't make up at 14 or 15 what you lose at 8 or 9. And that we have maybe 3 to 5 million children in America that have that problem, but there may be hundreds of millions of children across the planet who are neither, and disproportionately girls in the southern, in the global South, is to use Vint's term. We have that to me concerns me. I mean, there's one thing that keeps me awake at night about the digital divide and the work I've done is, how did we get to this point? And what should we be doing to address it? What makes me feel great is, look, we are learning so much. Again, I hate this pandemic. My hometown of Queens was ravaged. There were, within 10 or 12 blocks where I grew up, there was a death per block in March and April. So I feel this pandemic awfully and personally, but it's also making us rethink how we provide healthcare. And it's making us rethink how we educate ourselves. And it's giving us new ways of doing commerce and reaching people in ways we never thought about reaching people before. So I think we're going to come out of this period of time with a stronger, more robust, more thoughtful approach. We're not going to approach education or healthcare or commerce in 2022 the way we did in 2019. And a lot of innovation is going to come out of that. So again, I'm not a teletopian, but I am the kind of person who says, look, smart people will figure out workarounds around horrible situations. We're in a horrible situation. Let's figure out those workarounds, and then let's glide forward when we get out of this pandemic.
Okay.
So, thank you, Larry. From my part, first of all, the connectivity problem and getting everybody connected affordably and reliably is critical. But I wanted to tackle the education point that Larry was making. Here's what I think the COVID-19 is teaching us. It's teaching us that it's not so important to learn X, Y, and Z. What's important is to learn how to learn X, Y, and Z. And the reason I think that's valuable is that if our lifetimes increase, which I sincerely hope and believe they will, if you have a life of 100 years in length, you'll have a career that could be 70 or even 80 years long. There is no question that you must learn new things in order to be productive and useful during the course of such a long career. And that means you have to learn how to learn. It means you can't drop everything and go back to school on a permanent basis. We are going to have to transform the way in which we learn and the things that we learn in order to make sure that we can learn at need effectively and quickly. And so I think that the extent to which the internet has a role to play in there, of course, I'm very happy. But I think this mindset of you have to learn X and be able to regurgitate it must be replaced with a demonstrated skill and ability to learn new things. And sometimes that's by doing. Guess what? Apprenticeship ideas are fabulous because you get to do something and you learn from masters and you learn from your own mistakes. But learning how to learn has got to be the key to a successful future.
Great. Well, I think that's all we have time for tonight. I'm sure you guys could keep talking about all this. It's super interesting. But a big thank you, Vint and Larry, to both of you for spending time with us this evening. And thanks to all the GW students who joined us and submitted questions ahead of time. We encourage everyone to fill out the post-event survey so we can improve these events in the future. The keyword for the survey tonight to win a pair of noise canceling headphones is NSTMF Unscripted. Have a great night, everyone. Thanks, you two.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Had a great time.
Take care. Enjoyed myself. Bye, Vint.
Bye.
And bye, Sarah.